It was a quiet Saturday morning when David rolled up his garage door and stepped into the sunlight. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and a few kids were already riding bikes up and down the street. He stretched his back, took a deep breath, and looked at the tables he had set up the night before. Rows of old tools, books, and furniture sat neatly organized, each with a small sticker showing the price. Nothing fancy, just a garage sale, something ordinary people did all the time. David had moved into the neighborhood about a year earlier. It was a nice area, full of tidy lawns and similar-looking houses painted in soft beige and cream colors, the kind of place where everyone waved but not everyone truly knew each other. After years of working long hours in the city, he had wanted peace. His job as a detective chief had always been stressful, full of unpredictable calls and heavy responsibilities. When he bought this house, he told himself he'd finally have weekends where he could just relax, mow the lawn, or do something simple, like clean out the garage. He didn't tell anyone much about his job. It wasn't a secret, but he had learned that when people found out he was a high-ranking officer, they acted differently. Some got nervous. Others started asking for favors or stories about crime cases. He preferred being just David, the quiet guy who keeps to himself. By 9 a.m, a few neighbors had started stopping by. A middle-aged woman with a friendly smile bought some gardening tools. A young man from down the street asked about a drill set. Kids came by to look at the toys he was selling from his nephew's old collection. The mood was light and cheerful. People chatted, laughed, and complimented his organization skills. David enjoyed the normalcy of it. For once, no one was in trouble, and no one needed him to fix a crisis. It was just people connecting over small things, old books, picture frames, and memories. Around mid-morning, a car slowed down near his driveway. He noticed a woman in her late 50s sitting behind the wheel, squinting toward his garage like she was examining a crime scene. She had sharp features and a neat bob haircut. After a few seconds, she parked across the street and got out, clutching a clipboard and a phone. David had seen her before. Her name was Karen, though most of the neighbors called her the HOA watchdog behind her back. She was the kind of person who measured lawn heights and sent complaint emails if someone's trash can stayed out too long. Always dressed neatly, always ready to correct someone. She marched straight toward him, her shoes clicking on the pavement. "Good morning," she said, though her tone didn't sound friendly. "I wasn't aware there was a community sale scheduled for today." David smiled politely. "Good morning. It's not a community event, just me cleaning out the garage. I've been meaning to do this for months." Her eyes narrowed. "Did you get HOA approval?" "Approval? For a garage sale?" he asked, trying not to laugh. "Yes," she replied firmly, flipping through some papers on her clipboard. "The HOA requires notification for any sales or events visible from the street. It's in the community guidelines." David hadn't read all those pages. He remembered skimming through the rules when he moved in, but most of it seemed like standard stuff. No loud parties, no weird paint colors, things like that. "I didn't know that," he said. "It's just a one-day sale. I'll be done by afternoon." Karen pursed her lips. "That's not the point. Rules exist for a reason. You can't just decide to run an unapproved sale. It affects the community image." A couple of neighbors nearby slowed their walk, pretending to check their mail but clearly listening. David kept his calm. Years of dealing with tense situations had taught him the value of patience. "I understand, but I'm not disturbing anyone. It's just a few tables. I'll make sure to clean up everything when I'm done." "That's not good enough," she said, crossing her arms. "We can't have people thinking they can do whatever they want." "I'll have to report this to the HOA." He nodded lightly. "That's fine. You can do what you need to." His calmness seemed to annoy her even more. She muttered something about people not respecting authority and marched back toward her car. David shook his head and continued helping a customer carry a lamp to their car. He figured that would be the end of it, but Karen wasn't the type to let things go. Inside her house, just a few doors down, she paced the living room, looking out the window every few minutes. She didn't like that he hadn't seemed intimidated. Most people usually panicked or apologized when she mentioned the HOA. She convinced herself that David was testing her limits and decided to make a point. She called the HOA president first, leaving a long message about how a man is running an unauthorized business from his driveway. When she didn't get a call back, she grew frustrated. Then an idea popped into her head. an idea she thought was reasonable. She picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency police number. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood," she said, lowering her voice like she was giving a secret tip. "There's a man selling things from his garage without any signs or permits. I think it might be illegal vending." The dispatcher assured her that someone would check it out. Satisfied, she hung up and stood by her window, arms folded, watching David chat with a customer. Back at the garage sale, David was laughing with an elderly couple who recognized one of the vintage radios he had for sale. He told them it used to belong to his father and still worked perfectly. He was enjoying the simple conversations, completely unaware that police cars were now being dispatched to his address. Around noon, a cool breeze started blowing, and the street grew a little quieter. Then in the distance, the faint sound of sirens echoed. David didn't think much of it at first. Old habits made him automatically glance toward the sound, but he quickly returned to helping another neighbor wrap up a set of dishes. The sirens grew louder. Then 2 police cars turned into his street, their lights flashing but sirens off. They parked near his driveway and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. The neighbors who had been browsing suddenly froze. A few started whispering. Karen's front door opened almost immediately. She walked out, pretending to act surprised, though she looked a bit too eager. "Officers! Over here," she called, waving her hand. "That's the man. He's been running a sale all morning. I believe he's breaking HOA and possibly city rules." David blinked, realizing what was happening. He sighed quietly and set down the cash box he'd been holding. The officers approached him calmly. "Sir, good afternoon," one of them said. "We received a call about a possible unlicensed sale. Can we speak with you for a moment?" David nodded. "Of course. I'm sure there's been some confusion." Karen stood a few feet away, trying to look helpful. "I tried to tell him he needed approval," she said loudly. He refused to listen. One of the officers looked at her briefly and then turned back to David. "Can we see some identification, sir?" David reached into his pocket and handed over his wallet. The officer opened it, glanced at the ID, and froze for a second. Then he straightened up, recognizing the badge and the name. Chief?" he said, his tone instantly changing. Karen's eyes widened. "Chief, what do you mean, Chief?" David gave a small smile. "Detective Chief David Carter," he said simply. "I work downtown. This is my day off." The younger officer next to him looked almost embarrassed. "Sir, we're so sorry for the misunderstanding. We'll clear this up right away." Karen's face went pale. "Wait, you're a police officer?" David turned toward her, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Yes, ma'am. And calling 911 for something like this isn't appropriate. There was no emergency here." The older officer stepped in. "Ma'am, this isn't a police matter. Holding a garage sale isn't a crime. You should take any HOA concerns directly to your association." Karen stammered. I didn't know. I just thought." David looked at her steadily. "You thought I was doing something wrong without checking the facts. That's how misunderstandings turn into problems." For a moment, the street was completely quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves. Neighbors had gathered around, pretending to look casual but clearly enjoying the drama. Karen's confidence melted. She muttered something about not meaning any harm and stepped back toward her driveway. The officers apologized again to David, who assured them it was fine. "Thanks for coming out. You did your job. No harm done." After they left, the atmosphere slowly relaxed. The neighbors whispered and laughed quietly, some shaking their heads. A few came over to pat David on the shoulder, saying things like, "Well, she finally messed with the wrong person, and that was priceless." David chuckled but didn't gloat. He knew people like Karen often acted out of insecurity more than malice. Still, he couldn't help but find the situation a bit ironic. Years of dealing with tense, dangerous calls, and today, his most dramatic moment came from a garage sale in the suburbs. He packed up a few items and poured himself a cold drink, sitting on a folding chair near the driveway. The day was still sunny, the birds still chirping, and yet he could feel a shift in the neighborhood. People had seen a side of him they didn't expect. He wasn't just the quiet man with tools and old radios. He was the person who handled a petty confrontation with calm authority. From across the street, he noticed Karen's curtains move slightly. She was watching, probably mortified. Part of him felt a little sorry for her. It couldn't be easy realizing you'd called the police on the police. He decided he'd let it go. There was no point in making it worse. Tomorrow everything would blow over and life would go back to normal. At least, that's what he thought. But as he was closing the garage later that afternoon, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw one of his neighbors, a kind elderly man, smiling. "You handled that well," the man said. "Most people would have lost their temper." David smiled. "You learn patience in my line of work." The neighbor nodded. "Still, I bet that was satisfying." David laughed. "A little bit." As the sun began to set, the last of the customers left, and the driveway looked empty again. The only sign of the morning's chaos was a single folded table and a few unsold books stacked neatly on the side. He stood there for a moment, feeling a quiet satisfaction, not just because he'd sold a few things, but because he'd managed to stay calm and keep control of a ridiculous situation. Inside his house, he turned off his phone and sat down with a cup of tea, ready for a quiet evening. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Karen didn't seem like the type to admit defeat easily, and in a neighborhood like this, small things had a way of turning into big stories. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. People, who used to quietly nod from their driveways, were now openly waving at David. Some even stopped to chat as he watered his lawn. It was as if yesterday's garage sale incident had somehow made him the most interesting person on the block. "Morning, Chief," one man joked as he walked by with his dog, grinning. David smiled politely, but tried not to encourage it. He wasn't looking for fame. He just wanted peace. Across the street, however, peace was the last thing on Karen's mind. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flashing lights, the curious faces, and David's calm expression when the officer addressed him as Chief. It had been humiliating. The neighbors had seen everything. She kept replaying the moment in her head and cringing at her own behavior. But instead of feeling guilty, her pride twisted it into anger. She told herself that he could have avoided embarrassing her if he had just followed the rules. She decided she wasn't done with him yet. David had no idea what was brewing next door. He spent the day cleaning the garage and moving unsold boxes back inside. Later in the afternoon, he drove to the local hardware store for some supplies, and when he returned, he noticed Karen standing near his mailbox with a phone in her hand. She looked up as he parked. "Afternoon," David said, stepping out of the car. She didn't smile. "I've spoken with the HOA board," she said sharply. "You violated Section 12, unauthorized sales. They'll be issuing a warning notice." David sighed quietly. "All right, I'll take a look when I get it." "You should know," she added, crossing her arms, "that repeated violations can result in fines. We take community standards seriously." "I understand," he said calmly, "and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." His composure made her even more irritated. She wanted a reaction, some hint that she'd gotten to him, but she got nothing. David simply nodded, thanked her for letting him know, and walked inside. That evening, as the sun went down, Karen sat at her kitchen table writing an email to the HOA board. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she described how the incident had made the community look bad. She exaggerated the number of cars that had stopped by, saying there were at least 20, and even suggested that some non-residents had been walking around the neighborhood because of it. She ended the email by requesting that the HOA consider implementing stricter enforcement procedures. The next morning, the HOA president, a man named Mr. Wilson, replied with a short message. "Thank you for your concern, Karen. We'll review the situation at the next meeting." That wasn't the strong response she wanted, so she decided to go door to door talking to neighbors about it. Most of them listened politely but didn't agree with her. Some even defended David, saying he was friendly and responsible. "I don't see what the problem was," one woman said. "He wasn't disturbing anyone." Karen frowned. "That's not the point. If everyone started holding sales whenever they wanted, it would turn this place into chaos." But people were tired of her constant complaints. When she walked away, they whispered about how she always made everything bigger than it needed to be. By the end of the week, her frustration had turned into obsession. She started watching David's house more closely, jotting down notes whenever he came or went. If he left his trash bins out too long, she took a picture. When he parked slightly over the line, she wrote it down. David, being observant by nature, noticed. He didn't say anything at first, but it was hard not to see her peeking through, her blinds or standing near his mailbox pretending to water her plants. One evening, he decided to approach her directly. He walked over, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "Karen, can we talk for a second?" She straightened up immediately, acting surprised. "Oh, hello. Is there something wrong?" "No, not really," he said gently. "I've noticed you seem to be keeping an eye on me. Is there something I should know?" Her face reddened slightly. "I just make sure everyone follows community standards. It's my duty as a resident." "I understand," he said, "but it's starting to feel a little personal. I'd appreciate if we could both just live peacefully." Karen stiffened. "It's not personal. I treat everyone equally." He smiled faintly. "Good. Let's keep it that way." Then he walked back home, leaving her speechless. Later that night, Karen sat by her window again, replaying the short conversation. Something about his calmness made her uneasy. He wasn't afraid of her like others were. She couldn't intimidate him. For someone who had always prided herself on controlling the neighborhood, that was hard to swallow. Meanwhile, David poured himself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, thinking. He had dealt with people far more difficult than Karen in his career. But this was different. In his work, he could use authority to resolve problems. Here, he just wanted to be a good neighbor. Yet he knew that sometimes people like her only stopped when confronted with consequences. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. Over the next few days, the tension quietly grew. Karen sent more emails to the HOA, claiming David had been disrespectful and challenging community order. The board, tired of her constant complaints, finally agreed to schedule a meeting to hear both sides. When David received the notice in his mailbox, he almost laughed. It looked official but overly dramatic. Notice of HOA review concerning unauthorized sale and conduct. He knew exactly who had pushed for it. That weekend, he attended the meeting, held in a small clubhouse near the entrance of the neighborhood. About a dozen people showed up, mostly out of curiosity. Karen sat near the front, her papers stacked neatly in a folder, looking proud of herself. David took a seat quietly at the back until his name was called. The HOA president, Mr. Wilson, cleared his throat and said, "We're here to discuss the recent complaint regarding an unapproved garage sale held at Mr. Carter's residence." Karen immediately raised her hand. "It wasn't just unapproved," she said. "It was disruptive and attracted strangers to the community. I warned him, but he ignored me." Mr. Wilson nodded. "Thank you, Karen. Mr. Carter, would you like to respond?" David stood up, buttoned his jacket, and spoke evenly. "I held a simple one-day garage sale to clear out old belongings. I wasn't aware it required prior HOA approval. When Karen informed me, I cooperated and packed up by the afternoon. The issue should have ended there." Karen interrupted. "But you were disrespectful." David raised a hand slightly. "I wasn't disrespectful. I simply explained my position calmly. Unfortunately, Karen decided to escalate the matter by calling the police. The room went quiet. Even Mr. Wilson looked surprised. "She called the police?" David nodded. "2 officers responded to my home for what they were told was suspicious activity. When they arrived, they quickly realized it was a garage sale. It was unnecessary and it could have been avoided." Karen's face turned red. "I didn't know you were—" He looked at her steadily. "That shouldn't have mattered." A few people in the room exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Wilson sighed. "Karen, that was a serious overreaction. The police shouldn't be called for something that's not a crime." Karen started to protest, but the murmurs from other residents drowned her out. One neighbor stood up and said, "Honestly, we're all tired of these little power plays. It's not the first time she's done something like this." Another person nodded. "She reported my lawn chairs once because they didn't match the community color scheme." Karen tried to defend herself, but the tide had turned. People were finally speaking up. David remained quiet, letting them talk. He didn't enjoy seeing her humiliated, but he hoped it would make her realize something. Finally, Mr. Wilson said, "All right, I think we've heard enough. Mr. Carter, there's no penalty for what you did. Please consider this matter closed, and Karen, maybe it's time to step back from enforcement for a while." The meeting ended shortly after. Karen hurried out without looking at anyone. Outside, a few neighbors gathered around David, patting him on the back and thanking him for handling things maturely. One woman said, "You showed more patience than I ever could have." He smiled. Patience gets you farther than anger. When he got home that evening, the street felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had lifted. The neighbors who once avoided confrontation were now chatting freely, laughing together. It seemed like the whole community had needed that meeting to finally speak up. Karen's house, however, stayed dark for days. The blinds were closed and her car rarely moved. David assumed she was embarrassed. He didn't hold any grudge. In fact, he felt a little sorry for her. People like Karen often craved control because they lacked it elsewhere in their lives. A few days later, he saw her outside for the first time, trimming her hedges. She looked tired but quieter, less sharp around the edges. When she noticed him watching, their eyes met for a moment. She hesitated, then gave a small awkward nod. David smiled and nodded back. That was enough. He went back inside, feeling that maybe things were starting to calm down. But as he sat down with a cup of coffee, a small thought crossed his mind. People like Karen didn't change overnight. She might have been quiet now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't quite over yet. And deep down, he knew it wasn't. The next few weeks passed quietly, or at least that's how it seemed at first. The air in the neighborhood felt easier to breathe after that HOA meeting. People smiled more, waved more, and even lingered in their driveways to talk. David noticed small changes. Kids playing freely without their parents worrying that Karen would complain about noise. Couples sitting on their porches late in the evening. It felt more like a neighborhood again instead of a rule book with houses. David's days went back to normal. He spent most of his time working at the department during the week and enjoyed the peaceful weekends at home. He liked simple things, fixing things around the house, taking early morning walks, chatting with his next-door neighbor about football. Every now and then someone would stop him to ask, half-jokingly, if it was true that he was a detective chief. He would just smile and say, "Yes, but let's keep it quiet. I prefer being just another neighbor." Across the street, Karen had become almost invisible. The blinds of her house stayed half-closed most of the time. She still maintained her yard perfectly, but she avoided eye contact and didn't patrol the neighborhood like she used to. People noticed the change, but no one said anything. Some thought she had finally learned her lesson. David wasn't sure. He believed in giving people space, so he didn't bother her. But one afternoon, while he was washing his car, he caught her glancing from behind her window. Their eyes met briefly. She quickly pulled the curtain back, but he smiled anyway. He wasn't angry anymore. He just hoped she'd find peace and stop making enemies out of neighbors. Then one Monday morning, a letter appeared in his mailbox. It was from the HOA. Inside was a short notice. Reminder: all residents must maintain front lawn appearance standards. Failure to comply may result in a fine. He frowned, a little puzzled. His lawn was neat and freshly mowed. He trimmed the edges every weekend and kept everything tidy. He wondered if the notice was a mistake, maybe sent to multiple houses. But as he looked around the street, he didn't see any other neighbors checking their mailboxes with the same confused expression. When he opened his garage later that day, he saw a small piece of paper tucked under the door. It was handwritten, the letters sharp and uneven. "You may have fooled the HOA once, but not me. Everyone must follow the same rules," he sighed. There was no name, but he didn't need one. The handwriting, the tone, it had Karen written all over it. David wasn't angry, but he was tired of the petty behavior. He decided not to respond. He threw the note in the trash and went about his day. But inside he knew it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't stop when they lost. They just waited for a chance to win the next round. A few days later, as he was leaving for work early in the morning, he noticed Karen walking her dog near his driveway. It was unusual. She usually stayed on her side of the street. She looked at his lawn, then at him. "Morning," she said stiffly. "Morning," he replied. She hesitated for a second. "You got a notice too, right?" I did, he said. I'm not sure why. My lawn's fine. She nodded slightly, pretending to act casual. I got one as well. I think the HOA is cracking down on everyone lately. David looked at her carefully. Maybe, he said. Or maybe someone's still holding grudges. Her eyes flickered for a moment, then she forced a smile. Oh, I wouldn't know about that, she said quickly before walking away. He watched her go, realizing she was testing him, trying to see if he'd react. He didn't. He just locked his car and drove to work. That evening, when he returned home, a few neighbors were gathered near the corner talking. One of them waved him over.
Hey, did you hear?
Hear what? David asked. Karen's been sending pictures of people's houses to the HOA again. She's saying the community's getting sloppy. David raised an eyebrow. Seriously? Yeah, the man said. She sent one of mine because I left my trash bin out a few extra hours. Can you believe that? David chuckled softly. Sounds like she's back to her old self. He could tell everyone was getting tired of her again. They'd given her a chance to start fresh, but she couldn't let go of control. That night he sat in his living room thinking about it. Part of him wanted to ignore her forever. The other part, the detective part, knew that sometimes silence only encourages bad behavior. He decided if she crossed the line again, he'd talk to her directly one last time. A week later, that moment came sooner than he expected. On Saturday morning, David was working on his front porch fixing a loose railing. He heard the faint sound of a phone camera clicking. When he turned, he saw Karen across the street, pretending to check her mail but obviously pointing her phone toward his house. He sighed and called out, "Morning, Karen. Need a picture for something?" She froze. "Oh no, I was just checking my phone." He shook his head. "You know you could just talk to me if there's a problem." She looked flustered. "There's no problem," she said quickly, then hurried inside. He didn't chase her. He just finished his repair and went back in, but the next day he got another letter. This one more serious. It was a formal warning claiming that his porch repairs may violate community design standards. David almost laughed out loud. He'd been fixing a loose railing, not remodeling a mansion. He knew exactly who was behind it. That afternoon he went to the HOA office himself. The woman at the front desk looked surprised to see him in person. He introduced himself politely and explained the situation. She looked at his file, frowned, and said, "These reports were all submitted by the same person." "Let me guess," David said. "Karen?" The woman gave a small, awkward smile. "We can't disclose names officially, but you didn't hear that from me." David thanked her and left. He wasn't angry. He was just disappointed. He had hoped she'd learned something from their last encounter. When he got home, he decided to take a different approach. He walked straight to her door and knocked. It took a few seconds before she opened it. She looked startled to see him standing there. "David," she said cautiously, "can I help you?" "Yes," he said calmly. "Can we talk?" She hesitated. "About what?" "About this constant reporting," he said gently. "You don't have to like me, but it needs to stop. I've done nothing wrong and you know it." Her mouth tightened. "I'm just doing my duty as a resident." He shook his head. "No, you're using the rules to bother people. That's not duty, that's harassment. You called the police on me once. I let that go. I forgave it. But now you're crossing the line again." Her eyes flashed. "You think just because you're a cop you can intimidate people?" He met her gaze steadily. "I'm not trying to intimidate you. I'm trying to reason with you. There's a difference." For a long moment they stood there in silence. Finally Karen sighed and looked down. "You embarrassed me that day," she said softly. "Everyone looked at me like I was a fool. I don't like being laughed at." David's tone softened. "Karen, nobody's laughing at you. People just want peace. You have a chance to make this neighborhood better, not harder. You could use that energy for good instead of conflict." She didn't reply. Her eyes seemed uncertain, like she was fighting between pride and guilt. "I'm not your enemy," David added quietly. "Let's just start over." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing at the door. That night she sat alone in her living room, staring at her phone. His words echoed in her head. She thought about how lonely she had become. Nobody waved to her anymore. People avoided her at gatherings. Even her closest friend in the neighborhood had stopped inviting her over. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of what she had done, not just to David, but to everyone. The next morning, she did something unexpected. She walked over to his house. David was in the yard cleaning up some tools. She looked nervous, holding a small box in her hands. "I brought these," she said quietly, handing him a few muffins. "I baked them this morning." David looked surprised but smiled kindly. "Thank you, Karen." "I wanted to apologize," she said. "I shouldn't have reported you. I guess I just got caught up trying to feel important." He nodded. "It takes courage to say that." She looked down, embarrassed. "I think I forgot what being a good neighbor actually means." "It's never too late to remember," he said. For the first time, she smiled genuinely. "Thank you for being patient with me." They talked for a while. Nothing serious, just small talk about the weather, the garden, and how quiet the neighborhood had been lately. It felt normal, and for both of them, that was enough. When she left, David stood for a moment, watching her walk away. He could see she was different, still proud but softer. Maybe she had finally learned something from all of this. Over the next few days, things began to shift again. Karen started greeting neighbors when she passed them. She even helped one family carry groceries inside. People were cautious at first, but slowly they warmed up. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For David, life went back to the peaceful routine he had hoped for when he first moved there. He'd sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over the rooftops, feeling that rare kind of calm that only comes after storms pass. But he never forgot the lesson behind it all, that sometimes people don't need punishment or lectures. They just need someone to stand firm without anger, to remind them what kindness looks like. And in a quiet neighborhood that once ran on complaints and control, that small act of patience changed everything. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood began to look alive again. There was laughter from porches, the hum of kids on bikes, and a sense of ease that hadn't been there for years. The HOA meetings were calm, short, and focused on real improvements, like fixing the playground lights or repainting the old benches near the park. It was the kind of normal life people moved to quiet neighborhoods for. David had gone back to enjoying simple routines. He'd jog in the mornings, wave to neighbors on his way to work, and spend weekends fixing small things around his home. Sometimes he'd even stop by the local diner for coffee with a few of the other residents. They often talked about funny things that happened during the week. Never anything dramatic, just everyday life. But what made him smile most was seeing how much people had changed toward Karen. It had taken time, but her small efforts were working. She greeted everyone now, sometimes with a tray of cookies or muffins. She even started helping the HOA with event planning instead of complaining. People still remembered her old habits, but they could see she was trying, and that counted for something. One afternoon, there was a community event planned, a summer yard sale, the same one that had started all the chaos months ago. This time, the HOA approved it without hesitation. Karen herself volunteered to organize it. When David heard that, he had to admit he was curious. The morning of the sale was bright and warm. Neighbors set up tables filled with clothes, books, and old toys. Laughter and chatter filled the air as people walked up and down the street browsing. David set up a small table too, mostly just to join in. He had a few old tools, some books, and a coffee maker he no longer used. Karen was everywhere that day, helping people find change, guiding cars to park properly, making sure no one's table blocked the sidewalks. But this time, she wasn't bossy. She was kind, calm, and genuinely cheerful. It surprised everyone, including David. When she came by his table, she smiled and said, "Looks like you're selling your detective gear." He laughed. "Not today. Just clearing some space." "Well," she said, "I wanted to thank you again for being patient with me before. I've learned a lot these past months." David nodded. "You've done well, Karen. The neighborhood feels different now." "In a good way." She smiled proudly. "I'm glad people see that. I guess I used to care more about being right than being kind." "That's an easy mistake to make," he said. "We all learn it sooner or later." The day went smoothly and everyone seemed happy. Around noon, a small storm cloud passed overhead, dropping a few minutes of light rain. People laughed as they rushed to cover their tables with plastic sheets. Karen ran around with extra tarps she had brought just in case. By evening, the sale was over and everyone helped each other clean up. It felt like a victory, a full circle from where it had all started. Later that night, as David sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, he saw Karen walking down the street with her dog. She waved and he waved back. It was a peaceful moment, simple and ordinary yet full of quiet meaning. But life has a way of testing people just when things seem perfect. A few days after the yard sale, a new issue started brewing. A couple had recently moved into one of the vacant houses at the end of the street. They were friendly and polite, but they liked to throw small get-togethers on weekends. Nothing wild, just barbecues and music. Most of the neighbors didn't mind. But after the third weekend in a row, a few people began to whisper about the noise. One evening, as David was watering his plants, Karen walked up to him. Her expression was calm but serious. "Have you noticed the parties down the street?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "They're just enjoying themselves." "It's not too bad," she nodded slowly. "I agree. But a few people have been complaining to me. They say the music goes on too long." He smiled faintly. "You're handling complaints again?" She gave a small laugh. "Old habits die hard, I guess. But I'm trying to handle it better this time. I don't want to jump to conclusions." "Good," he said. "Maybe talk to them nicely before bringing it up at the meeting. They seem reasonable." "I was thinking the same," she replied. "I'll stop by tomorrow." David was impressed. A year ago, she would have called the police at the first sound of laughter after 9 p.m. Now she wanted to talk calmly first. It was progress. The next evening, she walked down to the end of the street and knocked on the new couple's door. David happened to be walking nearby and saw the exchange from a distance. The couple greeted her warmly, invited her in for a drink, and they talked for nearly half an hour. When she came out, she waved to him, smiling. "All sorted," she said as she walked past. "They promised to lower the music after 10. No drama." David nodded, feeling genuinely proud of her. But a week later, the situation took a strange turn. Someone had reported the couple's backyard fire pit to the HOA, claiming it was a safety violation. The couple was confused and upset. They had followed every rule. They went around asking if anyone had filed a complaint, but no one admitted to it. David overheard the discussion at the next meeting. The HOA board said the complaint was filed anonymously. Karen looked surprised and swore it wasn't her. Most people believed her, but he could see in her eyes that she was hurt by the suspicion. After the meeting, she walked over to David and said quietly, "You believe me, right?" He nodded. "Yes, I do. I know you've changed." She looked relieved but still shaken. "I just hope others think the same. I work so hard to fix things." "You can't control what people think," he said gently. "You can only keep showing them who you are now." The next few days were tense. Some neighbors started gossiping again and Karen's smile faded. David could see her struggling to stay patient. It wasn't fair. She had truly changed, but her past was still following her like a shadow. Then one night around 11 p.m., David heard a loud knock at his door. He opened it to find Karen standing there, clearly upset. "Someone egged my house," she said, her voice trembling. He looked across the street and saw splattered egg on her front door and walkway. "Did you see who did it?" She shook her head. "No, but I think it's because of the rumor about that complaint. People think I'm back to my old ways." David grabbed a flashlight and said, "Come on, let's check around." They walked around her property together, looking for any clues. There were a few footprints near the curb, but nothing clear enough to identify. Still, he took pictures, old habits from his job. When they finished cleaning up, she looked defeated. "I tried so hard," she said softly. "I thought people finally forgave me." "Don't give up," he said firmly. "One bad thing doesn't erase all the good. Whoever did this, it says more about them than you." She nodded, wiping her tears. "You really think so?" "I know so," he said. The next morning, he quietly spoke to a few neighbors, not as a detective, but as a friend. He told them Karen didn't deserve what happened, and that spreading blame without proof wasn't right. Slowly, word spread and people began to step up for her. Some even came over to help her repaint her door. By the end of the week, the tone in the neighborhood changed again. People realized that blaming Karen for everything was unfair. The new couple even came by to apologize for suspecting her. Karen was emotional but grateful. She thanked everyone for giving her another chance. Later, when David saw her sitting on her porch one evening, he walked over and joined her. They sat quietly for a while, watching the streetlights flicker on. "Funny thing about second chances," he said. "Sometimes they come when you least expect them." She smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd get one. I was so used to being the villain in everyone's story. You changed that yourself, he said. People notice real change, even if it takes time. I guess so, she said, taking a deep breath. But I couldn't have done it without you being patient. You didn't have to be kind to me after what I did. He shrugged. Kindness doesn't cost much, and sometimes it's the only thing that works. She nodded, staring at the sky. You know, I used to think rules kept a neighborhood perfect. But now I see. It's the people that make it perfect. David smiled. That's the smartest thing I've heard all week. They both laughed softly. As the days passed, things truly settled. Karen became known not for her complaints, but for her helpfulness. She even started a small weekend club where neighbors would gather for coffee and share gardening tips. It was her way of building something good from the mess she once caused. David couldn't help but feel proud whenever he saw her laughing with others. She had gone from being the person everyone avoided to someone people actually trusted. It was a full transformation. One evening, as the sun set over the quiet street, David thought back to the day she had called the police on his garage sale. How strange life was, he thought. The person who once caused him so much trouble was now part of what made the neighborhood peaceful again. He smiled to himself and took a slow sip of his coffee. Maybe this was how things were meant to be. Not perfect, but human. People make mistakes, learn, and grow. And sometimes it takes a little chaos to remind everyone what truly matters. Months passed peacefully, and the neighborhood had never felt more alive. There was warmth in the air that went beyond the weather. It was the comfort of people who finally understood each other. Families chatted by their fences, kids played freely, and laughter filled the evenings again. David couldn't help but notice how much had changed. When he first moved into that quiet community, he had imagined peace. He hadn't expected drama, arguments, or police calls. Yet somehow, through all that chaos, the place had found its balance. Karen had become a regular part of that balance. She had joined every volunteer group, from neighborhood cleanups to holiday decorations. She even brought out her famous lemon muffins at every event. People who once avoided her now invited her over for dinner, or asked her advice about gardening. Sometimes David would sit on his porch, watching her chat with neighbors, and shake his head with a smile. He never thought he'd see the day when she'd be one of the friendliest faces in town. One quiet evening, as he was finishing up dinner, there was a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, Karen stood there holding a small envelope. "Evening," she said cheerfully. "I wanted to give you this." He took it, curious. "What's this?" "It's an invitation," she said. "The HOA's planning a neighborhood barbecue next weekend. We're calling it Peace at Last. I thought it'd be nice for everyone to just relax together." David laughed lightly. "You came up with the name, didn't you?" "Maybe," she admitted with a grin. "But it fits, don't you think?" He nodded. "It does. I'll be there." She smiled warmly. "Good, I'll save you a plate." The following Saturday, the park at the center of the neighborhood buzzed with energy. Tables were lined up with food. Children were running around with balloons, and music played softly in the background. It was everything a neighborhood should be. David walked in carrying a cooler and found Karen standing near the grill, wearing an apron that said Grill Sergeant. She waved him over. "I thought that title fit you better," he joked, nodding at her apron. She laughed. "Not today. Today I'm off duty." He helped her set up the tables and spent most of the afternoon chatting with the others. There were small moments that made him smile. A couple that had once feuded now laughing together. Kids who used to hide indoors now chasing each other through the grass. And even the HOA board members relaxing without any arguments. For a while, everyone just enjoyed being neighbors. Later in the day, as the sun began to dip low and paint the sky orange, Karen called everyone together for a quick speech. She stood on the small stage near the park bench, microphone in hand, looking both nervous and excited. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say something before we wrap up today. When I first moved here, I thought I was helping this neighborhood by enforcing every rule. But I learned the hard way that rules mean nothing if people don't feel welcome. I made mistakes, big ones. I lost trust, and for a long time I didn't think I'd get it back. But all of you gave me another chance, and I'll never forget that." The crowd stayed quiet, listening closely. "I also want to thank someone who taught me patience," she continued, glancing toward David. "He reminded me that kindness is stronger than authority. Without that lesson, I wouldn't be standing here today. So thank you." People turned to look at David and clapped warmly. He gave a modest nod, smiling. Karen wiped a tear from her eye and ended with, "Let's keep this peace going. Not just today, but always." The crowd cheered, and someone started playing music again. People went back to eating, laughing and dancing. It was a perfect evening, one that made every struggle worth it. As the barbecue went on, David found himself sitting at a picnic table watching everyone mingle. Karen walked over with 2 cups of lemonade and handed him one. "You really didn't have to thank me up there," he said. "I wanted to," she replied. "You helped me more than you know." He smiled softly. "You helped yourself. You chose to change." She thought for a moment and said quietly, "You know, I used to think being feared meant being respected, but now I realize people don't follow you because they're afraid. They follow you because they trust." "Seriously, that's something most people take a lifetime to learn," he said. They sat there, quietly for a while, watching the kids play. Then she added with a small grin, "You know, I still can't believe I called the police on your garage sale." David laughed. "Yeah, that's going to be hard to forget." She covered her face in embarrassment. "I cringe every time I think about it." "You must have thought I was crazy," he chuckled. "At the time, maybe. But now I get it. You just cared too much about order. You wanted everything perfect," she sighed. "And I ended up ruining the peace I was trying to protect." "Well," he said, looking around at the happy crowd, "you fixed it. That's what matters." The rest of the night went beautifully. As the stars came out, people lit small lanterns and told stories about old neighborhood moments. Someone even brought out a guitar, and a few of them sang along quietly. Karen stood beside David for most of it, watching everyone with a peaceful smile. "This is what I always wanted," she said softly, "a place that feels like home." "You earned it," he replied. When the night ended, people slowly began to leave, carrying leftovers and waving goodnight. David stayed behind a little while longer to help clean up. Karen stayed too. They gathered plates, folded chairs, and finally sat down on the grass, tired but content. She looked up at the sky. "You ever think about how strange it all is? How one bad moment can lead to something good?" "All the time," he said. "Sometimes life needs a little chaos before it finds balance." She nodded thoughtfully. "I guess calling the police on you was my chaos." He laughed again. "And this is the balance." For a moment, they both sat quietly, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. There was peace now, not just in the neighborhood, but between them. Over the next few weeks, life carried on smoothly. The neighborhood continued to thrive. David went back to work as usual, and every now and then, someone from the street would drop by the station to say hello or thank him for something. He was no longer just the quiet man next door. People respected him deeply now, though most didn't even know the full extent of his job. One morning, as he was leaving for work, he found a small note taped to his door. It was from Karen. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. I'll never forget that." He smiled and tucked the note into his jacket pocket. Weeks later, the community held another event, a small charity fundraiser for a local children's hospital. Karen took charge of organizing it, and this time David helped from the start. Together, they planned booths, games, and food stalls. It was hard work, but they enjoyed it. The event turned out to be a huge success. Families from nearby neighborhoods even joined in. When it was over, they counted the donations and realized they had raised more money than expected. As they packed up that night, Karen turned to him and said, "You know, I think I've finally found what I was supposed to do all along." "What's that?" he asked. "Bring people together. Not with rules, but with purpose," he smiled. "Sounds like a good mission." She grinned. "Better than being the neighborhood villain." They both laughed, remembering how far they'd come. A few months later, Karen was even elected as the new HOA president, but this time everyone supported her. She wasn't the strict enforcer anymore. She was the peacemaker. Her meetings were short, friendly, and filled with laughter instead of tension. David sometimes attended, but mostly as a quiet supporter. He didn't need credit or recognition. He just liked seeing the harmony that had once seemed impossible. One evening after a meeting, Karen stopped by his porch again. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "When I first moved here, I thought being in control meant being respected. But I learned that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn." "You taught me that," he nodded slowly. I'm glad something good came out of all that mess, she smiled softly. More than good. It changed my life. They talked for a while about small things, the neighborhood, her dog, the next community project. When she left, David stayed outside for a bit longer, watching the soft lights glowing from each house. The neighborhood was quiet again, just like he had always wanted. But now that quiet wasn't tense or lonely. It was peaceful, warm, and full of connection. He leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. He thought about how everything had started. A simple garage sale that turned into chaos, a call to the police, and a lesson in patience and understanding. Life had a funny way of teaching people things. Sometimes through kindness, sometimes through conflict, but always in the end, through change. David knew he wouldn't stay in that neighborhood forever. Police work often meant moving when duty called, but he also knew he'd never forget it. It wasn't just the place he lived. It was where he learned that even the most difficult people could change when shown patience.